It slices, it dices, it makes julienne fries. Well, not really, but swords are one of the most popular weapon types in Diablo 2 for a variety of reasons, not the least of which the broad number of functions available for this weapon set. Today, we're going to look at the unique swords of Diablo 2, and since it worked so well for the amulets, we're going to go mostly by level requirement, albeit within specific categories, so that every sword gets its fair moment to shine. Starting out, to keep things organized, we'll look at the normal difficulty swords. As with all uniques, you can upgrade normal uniques to exceptional and exceptional to elite, with the right formulas of course, but very few in the long run really benefit from this, either due to their functionality being independent of their damage, or just because it doesn't scale as well as later weapon options. So keep that in mind before burning your runes to turn any of these into their higher stat and level requiring counterparts. The one-handed swords start off with the bare bottom of the barrel of level requirements with the level 2 unique short sword Rixet's Keen. Easily one of my favorite starter swords in the game, with decent enhanced damage, a percentage boost to attack rating, and most importantly, a lovely 25% crushing blow, available all at level 2, with absolutely no stat requirements. The only major downside is, due to being such a low level item, it's actually kind of hard to find because it falls into that weird no man's land of ultra low level uniques that often require explicitly farming for them. Next up is another one of the super low level while super useful weapons, the Blood Crescent Scimitar, with increased attack speed, okay damage for the level, open wounds, and a solid 15% resist all, not to mention some lifesteal that is only somewhat useful in normal difficulty weapons, but still not bad. Blood Crescent is another starter unique I will almost always hold on to a copy of for lower level work, and thanks to being a bit higher level than Rixet's, it becomes a bit more common to find floating around. Not really upgrade worthy, this usually does edge out a number of starter rune words early on due to its just sheer usefulness. After that, we move on to something a bit more mundane, and that is a skewer of Crintiz. I keep saying it Crinitz, but it's actually Crintiz. The saber isn't bad, but it doesn't quite live up to the strong start that the last two swords had. It's still not bad though, packing okay damage for the level, ignore target defense, some stats, and mana leech. It's a good early zeal or double swing weapon, but will usually get replaced with a solid rare or a rune word fairly early on for me. It's not bad, and it does have its niche uses for low level experiences, but it's not something I'd get too worked up over having in my arsenal or not. Continuing in the one-handers, we have Gleam Scythe, which is decent damage, though not quite as fast as some of the other options even with the increased attack speed buff. It's unfortunately a weapon I want to like because it looks like a machete ready to hack its way through Act 3, and will work just fine for that in normal, but it's also quickly outclassed by other weapons and really doesn't have even a niche use other than just being an okay damage per hit weapon. Griswold's Edge is a sword that just doesn't live up to its name for me, and that's mostly because it packs one modifier that irritates the living sin out of me on melee attacks, and that's knockback. Other than that, it's actually a fine broadsword with okay attack speed, good damage, solid attack rating boost, good fire damage for normal, and a stat boost to boot. If there was a way to strip that knockback, I would actually use this on a few early characters, but usually it just ends up in the bin for me. Next, we've got a sword that's got a mixed history, and that is Hellplague, the unique longsword. This may seem like a weird sword at first, and it kind of is, but it has really solid fire damage. It's got okay enough poison damage, dual leech, and okay just actual physical damage. It makes it a lot of fun for sword users in normal, and the plus to fire skills makes it especially fun for a Holy Fire Paladin, since it functions in the same way as Mage Fists and Leaf, providing a bonus to all fire skills, not just sorceress ones. While it won't hold on in Nightmare for most classes, it's still a fun weapon that's often ignored. Colwyn's Point is the last normal difficulty one-hander, and it's another one with a mixed history as well, actually being sought after as an item at a few points in history. It's been somewhat relegated to the sidelines these days due to better options being available. It still packs plus skills, good attack speed and hit recovery, and okay damage, though it's just on the edge due to the level 29 requirement. It's nowhere near as strong as it used to be, and is one of those weapons most hurt by the power creep of, well, the expansion and just time in general. For the normal two-handed swords, we see weapons that receive a bit less love because people, well, they like shields, and only the barbarian can wield them in one hand. Starting with Shadowfang at only level 12 requirement, it's actually not a bad sword, for similar reasons that Hellplague is decent. Dual leech, good enough damage for the levels, solid elemental damage, albeit cold this time instead of fire, and even some cold resist in a vain attempt to make up for the lack of a shield. While it won't last into the mid-game, as a low-level character, it's actually good enough for getting through normal. Soul Flay follows a very similar structure, albeit mostly physical damage. Again, we have dual leech, but less. This time, all resistances though, which is a little bit better than the cold resist provided by Shadowfang. There's not much that is special about the sword, but as far as low-level two-handed swords go, you can definitely do worse. Now, Kanemel's Awe is an interesting little unique that most people forget about existing, but it's actually an excellent tool for chippy farming in normal, or even just equipping on a low-level paladin if your resists are fine from other sources. Mainly because this weapon may not be super fast, but it packs reasonable physical damage, okay fire damage, an attack rating boost that's pretty big for normal, and a whopping +6 to holy fire, which, in normal, can really ramp up your damage enough to carry you through by itself. The major drawback, though, is that it's a two-hander, and generally only useful to a paladin, with the bonuses being far less significant to any other class. Though after that, we have a sword I just don't like, and that is Black Tongue. I mean, I see the use of it, but outside of the poison resist, you can generally do better with a good 3-socket one-handed sword and a few Tal runes from the Countess. It has okay damage, it has some poison damage, and it has prevent monster heal, which is a bit redundant with poison damage, but there are so many other easier to find options that I would much rather use than this. After that, we have Ripsaw, a fun weapon, albeit not much more useful than Black Tongue, packing okay damage for normal, a nice 80% chance of open wounds to deal some extra damage over time, as well as keep things from healing. It's not terrible, and it has okay speed for a two-handed sword. It just doesn't do enough special to make it really have a special place for me, that I just can't really do with some like low-level rune words that do much the same, or even better. On the tail end of the normal difficulty uniques, we have the Patriarch Greatsword, with its minimum damage being almost as high as Ripsaw's maximum damage. It does okay physical damage for late normal, even in a pinch early nightmare, though I would want to find an upgrade fairly quickly. The Patriarch also packs some stats, damage mitigation, and a pretty good bit of extra gold for how early you can find it. The blind target functionality can also be used in a decent number of situations and strategies, but it's still not going to be like god tier or anything like that. Moving into the nightmare difficulty swords, or more precisely the exceptional swords, because you can find them in normal, we start on the one-handers with Bloodletter, another tiny sword that I have a lot of nostalgia for. It's not bad, and at only one level higher requirement and packing similar damage to the Patriarch, it's definitely far from bad. Combine that with increased attack speed, solid life leech, plus whirlwind and sword mastery, and you actually have a weapon that can easily carry you through Nightmare without a problem. Unfortunately, it's somewhat mediocre to upgrade due to a good chunk of its damage coming from an add damage function rather than a damage percent, but it's still good for the difficulty. While it may look less impressive on paper, Cold Steel Eye is actually a fairly solid competitor, with solid damage, attack speed, even mana leech, combined with nice modifiers like blind and slow target, all topped off with a 50% deadly strike, which makes this weapon do a lot more damage for a fast attacking character than you would think at first. It may look less impressive in the damage readout on your character screen, but what it deals out is more than enough for Nightmare because of that deadly strike chance. Moving on to Hexfire, we basically have Hellplague's big brother, plus 3 fire skills this time, and again we have the damage increase situation like Bloodletter where it's from the adds function rather than percent, but it's still not bad, especially since this has ignore target defense, which can help save you on having to invest extra into dexterity to get those hits against, well, just normal enemies at least, since ignore target defense doesn't work against bosses, for example. Packing some fire resist boosts as well, it can be good for certain fights, but it's usually not the top of my list for exceptional swords, neither is it at the bottom, it's just kind of good enough. After that, we have one of the more popular magic find weapons in the game, Blade of Ali Baba. What it lacks in natural, well, usefulness in its own right, it has mediocre damage and really not ideal speed. It makes up for that with per level boost to gold and magic find, in addition to packing 2 sockets that can let you kind of modify it in pretty much any manner you want. Will it ever be best in slot for a damage dealer? God no, but it's one of the more sought after magic find items in the game thanks to, well, all these factors that we just mentioned. Thank goodness it's fairly common, so it probably won't be too expensive for you to get a hold of if you're trading for it, and it's pretty easy to find if you farm Nightmare a decent amount. Then we move on to Ginther's Rift. A great answer for early physical immunes, though it won't carry its weight too well into hell. Ginther's Rift is an auto-repairing, okay damage dealing, fairly fast striking source of 50 to 120 magic damage on top of its normal physical damage, of course, though it is probably more well known for being one of the more common fashion upgrades to have an ethereal phase blade, since people used to seek out ethereal Ginther's Rifts for just that purpose. It's not even a terrible upgrade, it's just not quite on par with options of, like, say, Grief. Speaking of interesting items though, Head Striker is next and is definitely one of the more fun exceptional uniques. Is it terribly fast? No, but what it does do is scale oddly well for an exceptional weapon. With a pretty good base damage, it stacks on a scaling maximum damage boost, as well as a scaling deadly strike that can, well, get over 100% easily, meaning a guaranteed double damage with each hit. The prevent monster heal thing on there is just a nice little bit of icing on the cake. Despite some mixed opinions on it, I would definitely say Head Striker fits in among the better unique swords to find while making your way through Nightmare. After that, we have a unique that I love, but is also my bane, and that is Plague Bearer, the unique rune sword that is actually a decent weapon damage-wise and packs some nice bonuses as well, such as a reasonable amount of poison damage, some poison resist, and poison nova on striking. It's not terribly slow naturally either, and the reason it's my bane is because every time rabies comes up, this sword is not far behind. It's a fun option, but not necessarily the best option for that particular build. At the tail end of the exceptional one-handers, we have the Paladin Sword, the Atlantean. Decent damage, not terribly great speed, but a Paladin can overcome that. And it's got some good stat boost, a pretty hefty boost to attack rating. This makes the sword not bad, though moving up in the level requirement of 42 does make it compete with other, slightly more interesting options. I'd still use this if I found it usually, but again, if I had the better option, I would use the better option. Stepping into the two-handed exceptionals, we have a sword that I'll be damned if I can pronounce it right, and that is the Crotte Vomir, which every time I see it just makes me want to think crayon vomit, which, yes, I know the meaning of this French-named sword. It's not far off. That said, it's an interesting beast. Not terribly insane damage, but it packs a lot of defense and weird mods, massive attack speed boost, boosted run speed, slow target, and % damage reduction, making it an interesting defensive choice to wield, but not necessarily the best offensive choice. Continuing the weird name trend we have, and I have to say it this way, Bings and Zwang! A two-handed cold sword, casting Frozen Orb on striking, dealing a moderately chunky amount of cold damage, and freeze target. It's not really something I use very often. It's strange for sure. It could see even use on a few builds, but if you're going two-handed swords, I can think of plenty that fill this weapon's niche a little bit better, as far as like what you can make with rune words and stuff. Next, thankfully, is something a little easier to pronounce, and that is Vile Husk, a sword I actually like sneaking on Act 5 mercenaries if I find it early, thanks to that 6% chance to cast amplified damage. It packs decent damage, scaling damage against undead on top of that, which can help you clear out some of the unleachable buggers a little quicker. The poison damage and poison resist are nice to have as well. Usually this would get quickly replaced with a Lawbringer for Decrepify, but it is still a worthy mention for a cheap early barbarian merc option. Cloud Crack, however, is another fall from glory weapon, basically the sword equivalent of Goldstrike Arch. It packs okay damage, some plus auras, a few offensive and defensive perks centered around lightning, but most famously it packs a chance to cast Fist of the Heavens, which used to be a lot of fun with it, but over time has just sort of fallen out of favor as the game changed and made that trigger less useful and fun to play around with. Todesfälle Flamme, or Death's Flame, is a weapon that doesn't quite live up to its namesake, kind of falling into the same category as the Bing Wang, except with fire. I want to use it because it actually looks cool, but it just doesn't carry its weight well enough to be a main. That said, you can use it as an early source of enchant for a number of characters, provided you have at least the stats to equip it, which are pretty high. At the end of the exceptionals, we have a sword I have a soft spot for that also just looks cool. It's Sword Guard. Reason for the soft spot is I actually used to use one on a super early concentration barbarian right after Lord of Destruction release, because massive shining beacon of a sword, this is very much a defensive weapon, though it does pack okay damage. It also has one of the few off-shield sources of increased block chance, and also packs resists, a per-level defense boost with exceptionally low requirements for what it is. Is it a great weapon? Not really, but I will forever keep at least one of these after I find it because, you know, memories are a thing. And finally, we move on to the elites, the things you don't have to ask, should I upgrade this? Because it's impossible, starting with the lowest level requirement elite sword, Lightsaber. Yes, that's right, it only requires level 58. Lightsaber is a good tool for dealing with physical immunes, in many cases due to packing a good mix of elemental damages and packing lightning absorb for whenever that physical immune just happens to be lightning enchanted as well. Overall though, even with ignore target defense, while this sword is fun, I generally don't find myself using it very often except in very specific scenarios where lightning will be an issue, and even then I'll often lean on different sources of dealing with that, and I will prefer different swords. Next up, we have Blood Moon, which basically reads like, we need a blood sword, make something, and they really didn't put much thought into it. It's got open wounds, life per kill, lifesteal, and enhanced damage, with a blood golem charge. This is actually one of the only weapons I can honestly say I have never bloody used. Next though is Jin Slayer, a weapon that I have actually used a few times, yay for that. While comparable in damage to Blood Moon, it actually packs a fairly sizable amount of fire damage, 2 open sockets, and requires more strength than dexterity, making it a little easier to wield on characters not going for max block. After that is the first of the weird O-skill swords, Frostwind. This one is most well known for its massive boost to Arctic Blast, which due to being an O skill means it's limited to only +3 on a druid, so don't get any funny ideas. Outside of that, it's pretty much just the ice version of Jin Slayer with slightly better perks but lacking the sockets. It's fairly fast, decent cold damage, and it has a freeze target effect. Is it good for like handling some physical immunes and certain characters in a pinch? Yeah, actually with the amount of cold damage it does, though obviously a dedicated source of elemental damage will generally be better than just weapons with chunky cold or fire damage, but you use what you can get and what you need. That said, we do actually have a great physical immune killer, namely because it will just make you completely ignore like ghost physical resistance entirely. It kind of does that for all undead, by the way. And that is Alzorath, the highest level requirement unique sword in the game at level 85. It comes with plus all skills, great attack speed, decent damage for a phase blade, bonus to all attributes, and 500 to 1,000 non-physical damage per hit. Half cold, half magic. The main reason it's slept on is because most unique phase blades you'll find are going to be lightsabers, not this, so you have to be super lucky to get it. That said, while it's no grief, it's still a great weapon to have as an option for a number of builds, at least against normal enemies. To round out the home stretch, we have the elite two-handed sword, starting with a classic, highly sought-after weapon, Doombringer. While not as well known as Grandfather due to a few reasons, Doombringers are still fairly heavy hitters in the space with decent damage, weaken on striking, a big boost to attack rating, and life leech per hit, and a whopping 20% boost to maximum life. Before version 1.1, these were actually kind of highly sought after uniques, and one of the forgotten super expensive items of the day. Smack dab between the two legends though, we have Flamebellow, the Inferno cousin of Frostwind, though notably less useful unless you need some of the odd mods on it. It's a two-handed fire sword that is outclassed by your one-handed fire sword options. There's not much else to say about it besides, hey, it's got Inferno. And last, and far from least, is the ever-famous Grandfather, and frankly, it has always felt like it was half the inspiration for Breath of the Dying. With being indestructible, with big damage and attribute bonuses, and an attack rating and scaling max damage boost, it can get to quite solid amounts of damage, and it used to be highly sought after, but anymore, not so much, since it's outclassed by items that are much easier to make and find. It's still a novelty collector's item though, and actually will sometimes fetch a reasonable price, because it is still a reasonable weapon in and of itself. It's not going to be Charcy food, it's just not going to be your final setup kind of weapon usually. So what's your favorite unique sword, and what unique category should we do next? Axes, armors, pants? Oh wait, this game doesn't have pants. Either way, mention it down below, and there's a special thanks to all the channel members, patrons, and active viewers that make this content possible.